This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. It's Friday, the 13th of May in 1870, and the city of Edinburgh has fallen silent. Flags are hanging at half-mast, the university has closed, and the stock exchange has suspended its transactions. The city is at a standstill. Through the hushed streets, 6 magnificent horses pull the hearse of Sir James Young Simpson. Every inch of space is packed, faces press against windows, balconies are overflowing, even the rooftops are crowded, people clinging to chimney stacks for a glimpse. A nation mourns, but who is this man and what did he do? We are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Marisa Haetzman to discuss her work as an anesthetist and author and hear about how she found inspiration in the Victorian obstetrician and pioneer in anesthetics, Sir James Young Simpson. Marisa, welcome to the podcast. So I'm going to start off with our warm-up question, which we put to all of our guests, which is, if you could be present for any moment in medical history, what would it be and why?
Well, the incident that springs to mind immediately is November 1847, when James Young Simpson discovered the anaesthetic effects of chloroform round his dining room table at 52 Queen Street in Edinburgh. I think that would have been, the more I read about it, the more I think it would just have been an incredible evening. And one of the reasons it's such an attractive prospect is the house where Simpson lived. There was always something going on. Any dinner party at his house would have been interesting anyway. But the night they discovered chloroform obviously was a very particular night. But it was the fact that he and his assistant sat round the dining room table in the evening after dinner and started sniffing various chemicals, trying to find something that was better than ether. And then this night in question, the 4th of November, they had been sniffing a variety of chemicals. Nothing seemed to be working. And then they discovered a kind of something that had been abandoned at the back of a cupboard because it looked very viscous and they didn't think it would be very volatile. And they poured some into a number of tumblers, took a sniff, and in Simpson's own words, were under the mahogany in a thrice. And then what followed on from that is interesting because this was one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the 19th century. And what they did was not start making notes or be very serious about it. They invited everyone else who was in the house into the dining room and got them all to take a sniff as well, leaving various members of the family semi-conscious, which is really not like any dinner parties I attend. I don't know about anyone else, but I think it would have been probably a combination of frightening and exhilarating and entertaining.
We're going to talk a lot about James Young Simpson today. He was definitely a remarkable man. But Marisa, just to start us off, you are a consultant anaesthetist, you are a medical historian, your husband Chris is a fictional crime writer, and together you form the duo, the author Ambrose Parry. And you have written remarkable, absorbing stories steeped in medical history. How did this unique writing partnership come about?
It was, oh, I guess it wasn't planned. I would certainly put it that way. Um, but I was working in anaesthetics. I'd been a consultant for about 10 years and I had always harboured a desire to go back to university and study something just for the sake of it. And so I decided to take a year out of my anaesthetic career and I went back to Glasgow University and did a 1-year master's in the history of medicine. And I remember it had been such a long time since I had been to university and I found just having to write essays and seminar papers quite challenging because it was not something that I was used to. And when it came to the dissertation, I decided to try and play to my strengths a bit and do something about the history of anaesthesia. And I found out that the Lothian Health Board archives still had the case books from the maternity hospital in the 1840s, around the time when ether and chloroform were first being used. And I decided to look into the early use of ether and chloroform because their use in obstetrics was very controversial. So you don't really research ether and chloroform in Edinburgh without coming across James Young Simpson, who of course I knew about but didn't know a lot about. And the more I researched him, the more interesting he became. He's an absolutely fascinating man. And I started telling my husband Chris about some of the things that I was discovering, and Chris being an author, and as he says, a magpie for kind of gathering up shiny things that might be useful. He kept saying, I think there's a book in this. I think there's definitely a novel in this. And I ignored that initially, thinking it was just something he was saying off the cuff, but he kept returning to it. And so initially I thought I would provide the research for him and then he would write the novel. But there was so much research, it was quite complicated stuff. And I didn't see how he could kind of parse through all of it to discover a novel in there. I thought, plus he didn't have enough time. He writes a book a year. So we decided we would collaborate and write it together. And that's what we did.
So your master's thesis as well, the research that you took there, really, you can sort of see this, your book, The Art of Dying, where James Young Simpson is a key character, is so well researched. It really illuminates James Young Simpson as a sort of very endearing, admirable, and admired man. And you really weave fact and fiction together with a lot of scenes taking place, like you say, in his house in Queen Street. So that Georgian townhouse with the high ceilings where he lived with his family and had his practice. It was a sort of whirlwind of activity happening there. So he's definitely one of my favorite real life surgeons. What drew you to James Young Simpson?
I think it was having read about Simpson and a lot of his contemporaries as well. He was a man who seemed to be driven by a humanitarianism, a deeply held humanitarianism and a desire to alleviate pain in all its forms. And I think that attracted me to him because a lot of medical practitioners in the 19th century were very keen on establishing a lucrative practice. It was very hard to make money in some fields. And a lot of people, I think it's fair to say, became very enamored of themselves. They were quite egotistical. I think you probably had to be to succeed in that field at that time. But there was something about Simpson that he was just so warm, so caring. And also he had this mischievousness about his character. And some of the things that we read about his home life, about the fact that he was very much a hands-on father. He liked to spend time with his children. They weren't confined to the nursery at the top of the house. They were allowed to roam about as long as they didn't bother the patients. And he used to say that he would always find time about 5 o'clock to come home for tea and an egg and a romp with the children. And it was some of these really, I don't know, some of these very endearing characteristics that drew us to him. Because Chris used to say that he'd always had an interest in writing historical fiction. He didn't have the time to do the research, but he said that the one area he was not interested in was the Victorian period. And so it took a character like Simpson to kind of disabuse him of that kind of prejudice against Victoriana. And I think he thought that Victorian gentlemen, Victorian kind of middle class and upper middle class households were kind of boring and patrician, and it was all very stiff and formal. And reading about Simpson changed his mind.
I can completely understand that as well. And I think that's so true about James Young Simpson, is that we are allowed such a sense of his personality and his life alongside his great achievements.
So, this pioneer in terms of chloroform as a pain relief, but also that pivotal role he plays in advancing midwifery and obstetrics, and just a social reformer too. But also, this great sense of larger than life fun. So we have a lot of items in the collections here at Surgeons Hall Museum that were owned by Simpson or influenced by him or connected to him. And one of them is a beautiful glass brandy decanter. And it's a very simple, elegant glass decanter with the word brandy inscribed across the front of it. And it would not have looked out of place at all, right? Sitting on a sideboard in that townhouse. But he used it to store chloroform, not brandy. So his house, the scenes in The Art of Dying, so much takes place in them, Marisa. You use that scene to really showcase what life was like, middle 1800s Edinburgh. How do you stay true to the legacy of James Young Simpson while weaving these fictional events through his life?
I think that was probably the most difficult aspect of the project, because my background was medicine and then history of medicine, and Chris is a writer of fiction. And I was very keen that if we were going to write about Simpson, we had to stay true to the historical facts, that we weren't allowed to change too much. We certainly weren't allowed to make anything up about Simpson's life or his family or any of his achievements. We tried to stick very rigorously to the historical truth as far as that was concerned. But we also realised that if you want to tell a compelling story, you can't just have the little bits of Simpson's life loosely linked together. You had to kind of come up with a narrative first of all. But there was a bit of tension between myself and my co-author about some of these things. I had to learn to loosen up ever so slightly when there was something that we didn't know, and I tried to find out something specific. And I would say to Chris, I can't find anything about that. There doesn't seem to be anything that covers this particular thing. And I would think that was a problem, and Chris would think this was an opportunity. And I think he's correct. I think when you're writing historical fiction, sometimes the gaps are the things that's your arena as a writer of historical fiction. You have to make intelligent guesses as to what might have been playing out, what people were thinking, how they felt about things. But there is a balance to be struck, I think, between telling a compelling story and providing, I don't know, a reasonable basis for people who are reading it to think that it's not all made up, that there is a lot of historical facts that they can rely on. Whether we've managed to achieve that or not, I hope so. I certainly hope so, and that's what the intention was.
So one of the ways I think you do achieve that is there are some incredible descriptions throughout the book of medical instruments, of surgical procedures as they were at that time. And again, the collections here have a lot of medical instruments from that time, of course. And one of them includes a set of Simpson's forceps. So these are forceps that James Young Simpson designed to aid the birthing process. And they are, pretty functional looking, black metal, these sort of long, elongated, looping handles that you grip onto the baby with. And they sort of come together at one end, so you'd hold on to them. And the set here was owned by Simpson's nephew, Sir Alexander Russell Simpson. That technique of describing actual instruments, actual surgical procedures, is that to provide a sense of authenticity or atmosphere, or all of those things?
I think I must admit, I myself was fascinated by the medical history of the time, and I was an obstetric anaesthetist for a long time, so comparing 19th century practice to modern practice was very interesting. Some things that have changed completely and some things that are still the same. Forceps are still used sometimes. The fact that in the 19th century caesarean section was really never used because it was so dangerous for the mother. There was loads of things that I found really fascinating, and I thought it was quite instructive to put in some of these historical facts. I think so many readers have said that reading the books made them feel grateful to be alive in the 21st century and not to have had to go through what our antecedents had to go through. And I thought, well, that's good. That's good if we recognise the progress that's been made and how hard things were and how important it was that men like James Young Simpson were pushing things forward, especially for women in childbirth, because it was very much a kind of neglected area, I think, especially pain relief. Most people considered it just part of the business and there was no point interfering with it. And I think it hopefully adds to a sense of authenticity, and hopefully people find it interesting in and of itself, how far we've come, and how far we still have to go, I think, in some cases.
And his contributions to advancing women's health were clearly very extensive. And is it true that Queen Victoria helped promote the use of chloroform in childbirth?
Well, I think when I was first reading about ether and chloroform and their use in childbirth, there seemed to, in a lot of the textbooks, there seemed to be an emphasis on Queen Victoria's use of chloroform and how that changed everything. But in fact, Queen Victoria had chloroform in 1853, and Simpson was using chloroform within 4 days of discovering it in 1847. So Queen Victoria was actually a little late. I think the ladies of Edinburgh were having chloroform long before Queen Victoria, but her receiving chloroform was very important because there was a lot of resistance to its use in childbirth, especially by the fashionable obstetricians in London, who were apparently very sceptical about anything that was arrived from north of the border. And so it was Queen Victoria's use of it, which they tried to keep secret initially, but her use of it, once that became common knowledge, the kind of resistance to the anti-scriptural nature of pain relief in childbirth had to kind of disappear, because you couldn't claim that the head of the Church of England was being anti-scriptural. So her use of it was very important, but I think the ladies of Edinburgh, and rich and poor, because the poor women in the maternity hospital were getting it, Simpson's private patients were getting it, many years before Queen Victoria had it.
And you also managed to capture Simpson's really eccentric nature, or there are many eccentric elements to his personality. The book includes a description, which I understand is true, of his household staff having to go through his pockets at the end of the day to find the payments from patients so that he could pay the bills. Mm-hmm. And he was an avid correspondent, an avid letter writer as well. So the archives here hold lots of his letters and lots of his correspondence. And I'm always amazed by the breadth of people he was writing with, like Oscar Wilde's father. You've spoken about this already, but given the huge amount of first-hand information that there is available, how do you prioritize your research? How do you focus on, when you come to writing each book, what to include, where to prioritize your time?
Well, I think it was very fortunate that Simpson left so much in the way of correspondence and clinical lectures, and there's so much. And also, fortunately for me, many people have covered this ground before. So there are about 5 different biographies of Simpson that I'm aware of, and they all vary. There was one written by a doctor, so it's very medical, one written by his minister, so it kind of focuses on his religious beliefs and his moral character. There was one written by his daughter about what a loving father he was, which is really quite touching. And there's a great one, one of my favourites, was Simpson the Obstetrician, which was written by a woman called Myrtle Simpson, who I assumed was a relative of Simpson's. So all of these different biographies drew on all the primary source material that existed that Simpson left behind, and focused on different aspects of the story. So that helped me enormously. Some of the primary source material is excellent, but you could spend so many hours going through it that because of the time restrictions, I kind of read all the biographies I could get my hands on, clinical notes that Simpson wrote, his clinical lectures, trying to get a handle on his teaching methods. But coming back to Myrtle Simpson, it turned out that she was a relative of Simpson. She married none of Simpson's children had children. So this was his brother's line. She married a Simpson, and she was also, this was fascinating, she was also an Arctic explorer, Myrtle Simpson. And when she was pregnant and wasn't able to do her exploring, was given a huge case of Simpson material that someone had in an attic somewhere, and went through it all and wrote this, her version of Simpson's story, which is full of little anecdotes about family life and excerpts from letters he wrote to his children, and is absolutely wonderful. And my husband Chris was very fortunate in that he was attending a book festival in Mallaig and met Myrtle, who was she's in her 90s, giving a talk about her Arctic exploration. And so we got her to sign my favourite biography of Simpson that she wrote herself.
That's a fantastic keepsake. Marisa, James John Simpson was also quite a pivotal social reformer of his time. So he advocated for rights for the poor, as well as supporting women, and particularly women's rights to access medical education. Yeah. Your research in that area, what has that been like?
Well, I think we have a character in the books who starts off as a housemaid but has aspirations to study medicine because of where she works. And I felt that that was a reasonable proposition because of Simpson's attitude to the education of women and the medical education of women, which of course was not allowed at this point in the 19th century. Women were not allowed to go to university at all, and they certainly didn't, those in charge didn't think it was suitable for women to study medicine. Their delicate constitutions were considered too delicate to cope with it. But Simpson thought this was nonsense, and he was very supportive of a woman called Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to gain a medical degree in America, who came to London and met Simpson in London, as far as I'm aware. And then several years later, when her sister Emily also got a medical degree in America, but not at the same institution, because after they'd done it once, they thought once was enough. So she had to find someone else to educate her. But she wanted to work with Simpson because he was very much a renowned figure of that time. He was one, probably the most renowned physicians, obstetricians in the world practicing at that time. And she secured a place working as his assistant at 52 Queen Street for several months in 1847. And that was quite a kind of bold and innovative thing for Simpsons to do, allow her to work alongside him, because an assistant's position was very much coveted, and she got one of those coveted slots for the whole of the summer of 1847. And interestingly, there was a letter that, there was a letter in the newspapers at the time about the fact that, and it was, the headline was "A Woman MD," and it was about the fact that she had asked if she could walk the wards of the Royal Infirmary alongside other doctors and medical students, and this was denied because, again, they felt that this was not appropriate or suitable. Just someone who was already medically qualified to see some cases the way that anyone else would see cases, and they felt that this wasn't appropriate. So the members of the board of the Royal Infirmary declined. So Simpson was definitely unusual in his position in supporting women studying medicine, and he continued to do so right up until the late 1860s, when the Edinburgh Seven managed to matriculate at Edinburgh University and begin studying there. He was very much a vocal supporter of them. And it's just unfortunate he died in 1870 because they really could have done with his support, I think. He was a voice that would be listened to, certainly. And when he died, that was a bit of a blow to their campaign.
When I first started to learn about this period in medical history, the period where Simpson was really at his peak, what struck me was just how cutthroat it was. It felt like if you were making a new discovery or publishing or sharing a new way of doing things, you were going to be met with outrage, rebukes, disagreements. It was not a collaborative working environment, shall we say. And we see this in Simpson's letters as well. So the letters here in the archives record the professional spats that he's having with people like Joseph Lister and James Symes. You are a consultant anaesthetist working today, Marisa. Is it still like that?
Well, I think I haven't actually been working as an anaesthetist for a few years now, but that was one thing that really struck me when I was reading about some of these professional spats, especially since gentlemanly behaviour was so much esteemed and lauded in other aspects of these characters' lives. But when it came to professional disagreements, it got really quite brutal. They would write scathing letters to the medical journals, usually using a pseudonym. They wouldn't even put their own name to it, but it was really awful stuff. They often ended up in court with each other because of the scurrilous things that would be said. There was also a case where Simpson was accused of medical negligence and accused of killing a patient by his negligence. And it all centred on a blood-stained mattress. And there was all sorts of, again, correspondence in the medical press and the national press talking about, without a lot of evidence, trying to blame him for a patient's death. And then there was a great story. And again, it surprised me because, to get back to your question about what it's like now, I have never seen anything like that in modern day medical life. I've seen loss of temper. I've seen people who maybe don't speak to each other, but I've never seen anyone hitting another medical professional in the street with a walking stick and then ending up in court over it. I have never seen people writing to the medical journals using a pseudonym to complain about someone else's techniques. That would never be allowed now. So it was very surprising reading how combative they were and how hostile they were to each other.
And all of that without social media at the time too, right?
Indeed.
The bloodstained mattress, of course, features in the book The Art of Dying as well. And it's, again, a really wonderful example of a real life thing that happened. Where you use fictional characters around that story to really bring it to life as too, which is just fantastic. So you have another book coming out.
Yes.
Summer 2025?
Yes, this is the 5th book in the series now. I had thought that when we started the series, we would get towards the end of Simpson's life. He died in 1870. But there's so much going on in this world that we've only made it to 1854 now. But it's called The Death of Shame, and it's set in 1854 in Edinburgh, and it's out in summer 2025.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Marisa.
You're very welcome.